Professor Savers joined the faculty at the University of Nebraska College of Law in 1989. She received her BS degree from Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, and her MS in Business from University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was elected to the membership in the Beta Gamma Sigma Business Honor Society. She received a JD degree, cum laude, from the University of Minnesota, where she served as managing editor of the Minnesota Law Review. She also served as managing editor. Oh, I said that. She was admitted to the Minnesota Bar in 1979 and the Nebraska Bar in 1989. Her primary interests are in the areas of administrative law and immigration and its intersection with gender issues. The immigration area appeals to her because of her appreciation of the differences of people from various cultures. She currently serves as chair of the ABA Administrative Law Section and as a member of the UNL Human Trafficking Conference. She's a frequent national and international presenter on immigration and administrative law issues. So her talk today is Unaccompanied Children Crossing the Border. What's trafficking got to do with it? So help me welcome Professor Savers.
So unaccompanied children seeking admission into the United States, hoping to stay. We've had a lot of attention focused on that this summer, but throughout our history, we've had unaccompanied children entering the country, either through Ellis Island or across the border. This depicts a group of unaccompanied children coming in 1908. This depicts some children that were coming into the United States also about that time because their mothers had been killed in Russia. They had been killed in Russia simply because they were Jewish, and so they were fleeing to the United States. Often when these children came, it was up to people in the United States to welcome them, to provide bonds so they could be released from Ellis Island, and also to provide some method that they could make their way in a life in the United States. We haven't always been so welcoming of people coming to our borders. For example, some of you may have heard of the SSS St. Louis voyage in 1939. It was a ship that had about 900 Jewish individuals trying to seek some freedom from what was going on in Europe. And they came to Cuba under the understanding that Cuba was going to provide a method for them to stay here in this hemisphere. Cuba refused to let them in, and they tried to get a negotiation with the United States to allow them to come in. Families, children, and they were denied. The United States did not let them in. The ship turned around, went back to Europe, and about 250 of those people were eventually killed by the Nazis. Now we're focusing on another crisis that's going on in the world, that's going on in our country. Tens of thousands of children and families are seeking admission to the United States. Now this is unique to us. We don't usually have about 10,000 or more people at one time coming in, but around the world they're faced with this kind of crisis all the time. These are Syrian refugees trying to come in to Turkey, but that's happening around the country when some catastrophe happens. These are refugees, immigrants seeking admission into Italy and into Spain. 100,000 migrants. So we can have 100,000 people seeking admission to our borders, but we don't have that. What we do have, that we've focused on a lot this year, is the child migrant surge, as it's called. These child migrants are coming into the country and hoping to get some kind of relief from what's happened to them, primarily in the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Of the children coming in the last 3 years, they have been primarily from these three countries, 34% to 37% Guatemala, 26% El Salvador, and about 30%. Honduras has been the fastest increasing group. You can see with respect to unaccompanied children from about 968 in 2009 to 17,000. It's also been the same with respect to family units. Biggest increase on the southwest border has been with respect to people coming in from Honduras. So what are we to do? Why are these children coming? Why are these families coming? Various non-governmental organizations have tried to identify this problem. So why was there about 24,000 unaccompanied children coming in the fiscal year of 2013? And in this year, we've estimated from anywhere from 70,000 to 60,000 children may come in. Family units and an increase, but also unaccompanied children. Again, in the southwest border. The dramatic increase, Honduras about 593% from fiscal year 2011 until fiscal year 2013. Now, this year, we've seen a change. We saw in the midst of the peak, the crisis, that about 10,600 children were coming in across the border per month. That was in June when it was measured. Went down somewhat, and last month, in August, that decreased to about 3,000. So some say maybe the crisis is over. But even if we don't still have the large numbers coming in, we have to decide what can we do about the children? Why are they coming? There are a number of reasons that children flee their homes. Maybe it's because of abuse in their home. It might be because of general violence in the society. It might be because they're deprived of the kinds of things they need as necessities. Or it may be simply because they have a family or other opportunity here in the United States. So we have to determine that. In trying to determine why the children are coming and what we should do when they cross the borders, there are really 4 areas of law that we need to consider. So some of you have studied juvenile law, some of you will study it later. But you know there's a juvenile court system here in the United States that started in the 1800s. And the primary factor used when dealing with children is the best interest of the child. What is the best interest of the child with respect to where they're to be placed? What is the best interest of the child when it comes to dealing with them with respect to some criminal matter? In immigration law, for most of the centuries that we've had immigration law, the thought has been children are really just properties of their children, of their parents. The only way they come to the United States is because of their relationship with a parent or other relative. The parent gets to come in because they have skills we want, or because they already have another family member, and the children can only accompany them. Another branch of immigration law, but it's really a little bit different because it's based primarily on international agreements that we have regarding refugees. So for example, after the SS St. Louis in 1939 and after World War II, it was agreed that nations would never again treat refugees like that. So the United States signed on to those treaties, and when a person actually gets to the country, we're really calling it asylum law, but they're really using the same kind of restraint. Do they qualify as a refugee? But under the asylum law, again, even if it's a child unaccompanied, they weren't treated any different from an adult. And these children, in most cases, could only get in if their parents qualified for asylum. And then the fourth body of law is human trafficking law. Been a relatively recent kind of law that's been adopted in the United States, but the goal is to protect people who have been trafficking victims, to prosecute people who engage in trafficking, and try to prevent trafficking in the future. So let's think about these first 2 bodies of law, juvenile law and immigration law. In 1990, Congress finally passed a law which tried to combine juvenile law and immigration law. Some consideration of the best interest of the child, the unaccompanied child, that might reach the United States. So it's been modified somewhat over time. But basically the qualifications are, to qualify for this, you have to be unmarried. Now you have to be under 21, used to be 18. That's a little bit problematic because many state courts say you can only be a minor, a child, if you're under age 18. And the reason that's problematic is that the state court system has to make a determination as to whether there's any possibility of family reunification and whether or not you can be declared a dependent or in the custody of the state. If you can't qualify for this. So first the state makes its determination, then the federal government makes its determination as to whether or not they would qualify for this special status. But again, this law says, just like juvenile law and immigration law now, we're going to try to decide what are the best interests of the child. The other body of law I mentioned is the asylum refugee status. A person has to qualify for this by showing they have a fear of being persecuted or they have been persecuted under one of these 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Now, as you might imagine, the one that seems most ambiguous is membership in a particular social group. And it is the one that causes the most problem when cases are litigated today. So the Bureau of Immigration Appeals has given us a definition. In order to be in one of these groups, you have to have a common immutable characteristic that members of the group either cannot change or should not be required to change. So you might think about what groups are like that. But you might say, well, sex, women, maybe that's a group. But the problem with that, it has to be a particular social group. And so women, that's too large of a group. So they set about to try to define smaller categories. So some that have been recognized, for example, are gay Honduran males, based upon the fact that gay Honduran males are persecuted because of their gayness. Just this year, 2014, the Bureau of Immigration Appeals has recognized domestic violence, and they carved out a special group, married women in Guatemala, who are unable to leave their relationship and have suffered domestic violence. Some immigration judges, although not BIA-wide, have recognized former members of the MS-13 gang because of their gang violence. And then the fourth body of law I mentioned is the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, again based upon international agreements, but the U.S. actually passed our law before we signed on to the international agreements. And there are 2 kinds of trafficking that are recognized. Commercial sex trafficking, which applies for a minor to any person under the age of 18 that is engaged in commercial sex act. You don't have to show they've been forced, been defrauded, or coerced into it. But with respect to labor trafficking, you do have to show fraud, coercion, or force before you can recognize. But a minor could theoretically qualify for relief based upon that. Now, how do we know who qualifies as an unaccompanied child? In 2002, the Homeland Security Act was passed and defined the unaccompanied child as essentially a child with no legal immigration status, under age 18, who's come to the United States without their parent or guardian. So 4 qualifiers: no lawful immigration status, under 18, no parent or legal guardian in the United States, or no parent or legal guardian in the United States available to provide care. So we could qualify many of the unaccompanied children as child victims who might qualify for one of these kinds of relief. So remember the one in the middle, SIG, special immigrant juvenile status, they have to show they've been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And all the way up to the age of 21, they could qualify. The others don't really have an age qualifier, so substantively, they can qualify as a victim of persecution. Could be based on gang or family violence, at least theoretically. Or they can show they're a trafficking victim and get what's called a T visa, which means they have to cooperate with the prosecution. Or they could qualify for a U visa as a victim of crime. Now, some of the things that people have said, children have said about why they're coming, I have a couple of excerpts. My grandmother is the one who told me to leave. She said, if you don't join, the gang will shoot you. If you do, the rival gang or the cops will shoot you. But if you leave, no one will shoot you. So this has led a lot of children to leave their home situation. Now, in 2008, President Bush signed into law an amendment to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the William Wilberforce. You might have heard mentioned I went to school in a place called Wilberforce. It was named after William Wilberforce, who was from the United Kingdom, Great Britain, who was a liberator of slaves and tried to have slavery abolished. And so they think of trafficking much like slavery, and that's why it was named after him. But in that law, they said, well, we have some substantive laws in place that might help these children, but what we really need are some specialized procedures to help with unaccompanied children. Now, they did a couple of curious things. They said for unaccompanied children, we will have special protections for children coming from non-contiguous countries. So that does have the children from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But for contiguous countries, that is Mexico and Canada, they don't get as much protection. So that means essentially they could be sent around and turned back and go back to their homes immediately. And they would go through the normal procedure of deportation removal proceedings. But with the Wilberforce Act, now when they're apprehended by either of the departments, the Department of Homeland Security, they have to go to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where they're supposed to find shelter. They have to do it under a certain number of time limits. If they don't seem to qualify, they are removed to their country of origin, but usually they're released to a sponsor in the United States or placed in a federal long-term care program. And you can see over the time period how many children have been placed in this. And again, estimated 60 to 70,000 for this fiscal year. A number of federal agencies, all of these agencies have to do something with respect to these unaccompanied children. This last slide really shows when they do placement, the various kinds of family members or state programs where these children might be placed. And then we have just showing you how these are all related to each other. So now we have these new procedures in place. There are lots of challenges. There are lots of challenges because, I'll just finish at 30 seconds. For example, there's one facility they're complaining about the space that's given them. They're now placing them in video hearings, which a lot of people disagree with. So we're left with the question now, how can we really make these procedures work with respect to children that are unaccompanied? Thank you.